There's a bit of a paradox about every single cell in your body having the same genetic code. Like there are some 200 different types of cells in the human body that all do different things, but they all technically have the same instructions. You got teeth cells, nerve cells, eye cells, and butthole cells, and they all have the same genetic code in them. But thankfully, you rarely get teeth growing out your butthole. No, a butthole cell divides, becomes two butthole cells, and every successive butthole cell continues to perform butthole cell duties and shirks tooth duties. Well, it turns out there are mechanisms that influence what parts of genetic codes are read and what parts are censored inside each cell. And those mechanisms persist through cellular division and are even heritable to a degree. The epi in epigenetics is a Greek prefix that means on top of, in addition to, or as well as. So epigenetics covers things that affect genetic inheritance without changing raw genetic information. One of those mechanisms are clusters of 8 proteins clumped together called histones that DNA wraps and spools itself around. And they can be packed all together so the genes stuck in there between histones can't be transcribed, replicated, and are essentially turned off. Another way genes get turned off is called DNA methylation. Organic compounds derived from methane called methyl groups attach to DNA and make it untranscribable, and essentially turn it off too. There's a gene called the agouti gene that makes mice fat, yellow, and prone to cancer and diabetes. Well, scientists at Duke University took some genetically identical agouti mice and kept them in the same conditions with the same stimuli. Except just before conception, one group of mothers were given methylated food that contained those methyl groups that can turn genes off. With that diet, those mice's offspring are more likely to come out slender, brown, and live longer, healthier lives. So not only do epigenetics change how your genes get expressed, the environment can also change your epigenetics. And that can further affect successive generations' epigenetics or how their genes get expressed. Another study conditioned male mice to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossoms by giving them an electric shock when they smelt cherry blossoms. And eventually, the smell of cherry blossoms freaked them out, and without the shock, they'd be stressed and agitated. But what's crazy is those males were then allowed to breed, and their offspring were also conditionally afraid of cherry blossom smell. Near the end of World War II, a Nazi blockade cut off food and fuel supplies to a large portion of the Netherlands. It's called both the Dutch Famine of 1944-1945 and also the Hunger Winter. In the course of 2 years, people went from being well-nourished to starving back to being well-fed again. They kept really good records of food availability at the time. So we have a cohort of people who went through a well-documented famine. And the Dutch famine birth cohort study found that women who were pregnant during the famine had babies that were smaller at birth and had increased health complications later in life. Later in life, they were heavier and had higher rates of diabetes and schizophrenia. They also died 10% earlier than their nearby unaffected cohorts. Back before Darwin dropped evolution, there was this guy Lamarck who had a different idea of inheritance. A classic example is that giraffes got their long necks because certain giraffes would stretch a lot to reach the tallest trees. And that would stretch their necks out and they would pass the stretched necks to the next gen giraffes. Evolution curb-stomped Lamarckism. Now epigenetics is offering just a tiny bit of an apology to Lamarckism. Like, you weren't as wholly wrong as we always thought.